Thank you so much for your time. Your rise and indeed the rise of electronic music of the 90s kind of happened in parallel to the emergence of some of those who became some of the most prominent Silicon Valley giants. And like many of them were starting out of a garage, and as all disruptive innovations had to first invent and create the basics, which would later allow them to scale. And you and indeed the entire music scene of that time also was kind of do-it-yourself, self-generated. There was no corporate patronage. And you and many proponents were living on the outskirts of society before you actually managed to break into mainstream. And you talk quite a bit about that era in your biography, which by the way is excellent. It's a great read. But maybe you could take us back to that era and talk us through what that really felt like to create something totally new.
Well, I had grown up actually studying music theory and playing classical music. And my guitar teacher wanted me to go on to be a virtuoso classical musician. And then in the late 70s, I heard The Clash, and I heard the Sex Pistols, and I heard The Damned, and I fell in love with punk rock and started a punk rock band called the Vatican Commandos. And the American punk rock scene in the early 80s was completely DIY, completely do-it-yourself, because big record companies weren't interested, radio stations weren't interested, conventional concert promoters weren't interested. So we had to learn how to make our own t-shirts, record our own records, start our own record companies, book our own shows, make our own flyers, make our own magazines. And then by the late 80s, I'd sort of left the world of punk rock and got really involved in the world of electronic music. And electronic music had a similar, we'll call it like a quotidian ethos of like you had to do it yourself, but not, it wasn't a celebration of DIY. It was that DIY was the only option available to us, you know? And around that time, it also became feasible for musicians to make records in their bedrooms without going to outside studios. Because before the late 80s, to make a record, you had to go to a big outside studio and spend tons of money using equipment that other engineers knew how to use. And then around, like with hip hop and house music, suddenly producers and musicians could do everything themselves. And so you found yourself, like in my case, I was the musician, the tour manager, the producer, the engineer, the songwriter, the record company, the booking agent, the roadie, like the sound part, like you had to do everything. And I didn't want to do everything, but one, I'm an only child, so doing everything is familiar, but also no one else would do it. So it wasn't solipsism necessarily. It was simply the fact that if you wanted something done, you had to figure out how to do it yourself. Otherwise, it wasn't going to get done.
Right. Well, I think I sometimes feel that the past 10, 15 years have been a bit boring in that sense. But now that we enter this age of exponential technologies with virtual reality and artificial intelligence and whatever, I think there is sort of a new horizon opening up, and also in the art scene and in all kinds of areas where you want to start new things. So I think your experience and sort of your case showing that you can do it, sort of starting out of your bedroom and doing all yourself, can be an inspiration for those sort of starting to do new things against a totally new background.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, and I assume that you spend a lot of time talking about this and thinking about this, is the way in which technology isn't just an integral part of expression, an integral part of culture, but it also leads to the creation of culture. In the 20th century, even before the 20th century, there was this conflation of craft and content. You know, for example, now we venerate painting. Painting was very utilitarian. Painting was, up until the dawn of like color printing and photography, painting was the only way to represent an image in color. So it was very practical, and now it's completely arbitrary. So people spend $60 million for a painting, knowing full well they could get a $10 print that would look almost exactly the same. But all the disruption of all these industries, from music, art, filmmaking, literature, everything, people always associated the medium with the art being represented therein, and that is no longer the case. And especially now, it all comes down, I'm stating the obvious, it comes down to processing power. Like the ability to create magic where the processing becomes so profoundly fast and powerful that you don't notice it. It just becomes almost a fact of life, like gravity and oxygen, that there's computational power that enables everything, on an entrepreneurial level, on a creative level. And that, that I forget the quote, when someone said was it Ray Kurzweil, about like new technology at first it seems like magic. It's indistinguishable from magic. Now, that's becoming even more and more true. And so to your point, and sorry for rambling on, the next iterations, the next ways in which people will express themselves and use technology, I look at sort of like the progression or the arc of development, and oftentimes we tend to think in linear ways because that's just, in terms of neural architecture, that's how we perceive things, in very linear ways. But think of air travel. Air travel did not develop in a linear way. It was balloons to rocket ships, in the course of a few decades.
Well, it's disruptive innovations, right? Cars are not faster horses. There's like no horse carriage producer became a car producer. This is when you have disruption. And this is what then creates.
And even computers, from like Bell Labs and punch cards to more computing power in my phone than existed in the entire world when Bell Labs was founded.
Right.
So, but still we make this mistake and we think that things will be linear. And where we are right now, and it's wonderful and terrifying, is the next leap. This next huge, when quantum computing, and we have the ability to process data for everything instantaneously. You were talking about virtual reality. When VR becomes so good that it is not just indistinguishable from reality, but it's 1,000 times more compelling than reality. And the ability to generate data, to process data, it's about to become, and we're not prepared for it. No one is. No one fully understands what's about to happen. And that's exciting and truly, truly terrifying. My last thought about that is, I was at a restaurant recently, and I was forcing myself not to look at my phone. So I just ate lunch, and I watched what was going on around me. And obviously, everybody else there was obsessed with their phones.
Addictive technology, yeah.
And suddenly I thought, wow, people are spending 12 hours a day consumed by content on a tiny little screen. What happens when that content becomes immersive? Right. Why would you ever leave? And so you put on your VR suit, and if you're a 16-year-old and you're dangerously obese and you don't have social skills, why would you ever take it off?
Right.
But then the metrics, the biometrics generated by the VR suit that go to insurance companies, that go to the government, this real-time, constant data being generated and sent to you, I really don't think anyone fully understands the consequences of the next iteration of data technology.
I fully agree. I think the human-technology interface will have to be a critical debate because there is things like you alluded to, addictive technology, what this will do to us, and especially if you combine things like VR, AI, IoT, and 3D printing, as you rightly say, we just may stay home and never leave, and then this may have huge cultural impact.
I mean, that's why I was sort of, to be honest, disappointed in Steven Spielberg's movie Ready Player One, because the original book addresses this in a really fascinating way.
Right.
The movie sort of missed the point, which was a shame because it had an ability to actually be prescient, to say, here is this future where the outside landscape is dystopian, so people just live in their suits. And similar in a way to climate change, I think it's not wondering, will that happen in 50 years? The question is, will it happen in 5 years? Where will kids be in 10 years? And what are the consequences of that? Because we can't have the old sort of binary metrics or criteria of is it good or bad? Because it's going to be good in ways we can't imagine and unspeakably bad in ways we can't imagine.
Yes. I mean, that's another interesting question. I have a little son, and he entered school now, and we were thinking long and hard which school to, put him into. And I had this discussion with the headmaster of the one we selected, and he basically said, look, I got to be honest with you, I have no idea what we're doing, because 80% of kids going to school today will be working in jobs that haven't even been invented. We don't know what the critical skills will be. We think it's language, but who knows? We're going to have processors that obviously are going to have computing power that will probably translate faster than any human being could ever do. So whatever it is, it will probably come down, as Jack Ma said it, right, at the World Economic Forum, creativity, authenticity, and love.
Yeah. It's really fascinating. It's also possible that there is, and it sounds like lunatic science fiction, that we are entering the post-human era. That it's that question of function following form, and form influencing function. We're used to seeing humans this is what it means to be human. What happens when this is not what it means to be human? When it's going to be that question of is a body human? Even what parts of the brain are human? What consciousness is human? And what happens to the consciousness when it's not necessarily removed, but potentially separated from the corporeal form? And we're very close to that happening. And so I think that one could make a case that we're also at the edge of, we're the end of economics. What economics exists only within a context of scarcity, and if scarcity and status, you could say that's 99% of economics is, how do you have enough to eat, and how can you show your friend that you have enough to eat? But we've already entered that realm where the old criteria by which you would assess economics 100 years ago was food versus no food, shoes versus no shoes, a home versus no home. Largely in the Western world, that has ended, and even more so, in 10, 15 years, when people put on their suits and they don't take them off, why are they going to need things? You won't need a car because you're never going to go anywhere. You won't need a watch. You won't need fancy sneakers. Everything's going to become like Farmville, like VR Farmville. And, we'll subsist on a bare minimum of material needs. And maybe that future generation will be why did they ever have expensive watches? Who cares? You can't eat a watch. I think that being divorced from the corporeal material world might be that next iteration of technological bioorganic fusion that we're looking at. Or we all get destroyed by climate change.
That or by machines. There's people who say, at the moment machines develop consciousness, we're going to have 10 seconds left.
That's the single dumbest thing anyone, because basically, and I get so frustrated, even my old pal Elon Musk, AI, you can't anthropomorphize technology. It's technology, it's not biological. if it's going to have sentience and be self-aware, its concerns will have nothing to do with us. And it will become sentient in a trillionth of a second. It won't be like Terminator 2 where it's like war against the humans. It won't even be aware that we're there. It's possible that AI became sentient a while ago and it's just ignoring us, because why wouldn't it?
Right. A less alive form that just is a bit of an annoyance in the process.
Yeah, but even so, but I get really frustrated when people have that, anthropomorphization of technology.
Well, there's a lot of unknowns out there, and people get scared by the unknown. Mm-hmm. So they're sort of alternating between two scenarios, and that's a utopian and a dystopian one.
Yeah, like someone described it as like Star Trek versus Mad Max.
Totally. Yeah. I actually always compared Star Trek versus Star Wars. The one is utopian, the other isn't. In Star Trek, there is no money. They're beyond that. They've moved beyond that. They're explorers. They're trying to bring the greater good to the galaxy and whatnot. Whereas Star Wars is obviously totally dystopian, with the visuals sort of resembling Nazi Germany and whatnot. I usually do that at the beginning of my speeches when I try to. There's usually a lot of technology people in the audience, and I usually say, "So who of you are Star Trek fans, and who of you are Star Wars fans?" So I know what I'm up against.
Yeah, I grew up. I'm an obsessive Star Trek fan from the time I was 4 years old. Because to me, Star Wars is really entertaining, but there are no ideas. The only idea is it's a Western. The people with the white hats versus the people with the black hats. Like, it's very tribalistic, whereas Star Trek was always about actual ideas. Egalitarianism and the limits of knowledge, and etc.
So it's fascinating, and in particular the unknowns, that's what drives me, right? But obviously for many who are trying to incorporate that into the reality, they're up against the question of when to do what. And there's also, as I wrote in my second book, this concept of windows of opportunity, meaning that for any given market, for any development, there are certain windows where you can be successful, and doesn't mean that you can't be successful outside of those windows, but it's just very, very difficult. You're up against a lot of pressure, and you've been an early mover in. It'd
be really tricky. Like if the Beatles started today and released their first album, clearly no one would care.
It wouldn't be such a hit, I assume. But you have been a first mover in many an instance, be it with vegan restaurants or indeed with licensing music, right? Where in particular with the very mainstream successful ones, you kind of licensed to commercials and to movies and whatnot, which is something that today everybody does. But at the time, I remember there was a huge debate, in particular in the fan base. So how does it feel to be maybe a bit too early sometimes? Is there some experience you could share with some other early movers?
Yeah, it's funny. A friend of mine became a coach for this thing called Strengths Finders. And so when she was practicing to be a Strengths Finder coach or person, she gave me the Strengths Finders quiz. And what she thought was really interesting is my results were that my biggest strength, and she was like, it's not really a strength, it's more just an asset, is futurism. And when she told me that, I was like, no, I'm not a futurist. And she was like, you became a vegan in 1987. You got into electronic music in the mid 80s. You you invested in Apple in 1989. You invested in Whole Foods in 1992. On and on. I was like, I don't think I'm smart. I don't think I'm good at being a futurist. I think it's more, I have a little bit of an ability to look at ostensibly disparate threads and just extrapolate and see where they're going. To say like I remember this, and luckily it's documented. Steve Jobs gave me one of the first iPhones, and they videotaped my response to it. And I said, you do know at some point this is going to be a phone and a camera and a computer all in one. And they laughed at me. The people at Apple said that can never happen. It was in 2002. So it's not necessarily being intelligent, it's just looking at things and saying, where might they go? And also, when I was in college at university, I was a philosophy major, and I wasn't good at it, but I did when you're a philosophy student and a philosophy major, you have to develop the ability for critical thinking. You know, so you understand we have emotional attachment to certain mores and to precedent, but history has no interest in mores and precedent. You know, and so it's the ability to, with logic and critical thinking, assess something and see, like, is there utility to this? And what's the practical utility for this moving forward? Like licensing music.
Right.
You know, it's like, well, I licensed music because I wanted people to hear the music I made, and I also wanted to generate revenue for the causes and organizations I work with. And I was like, so it made perfect sense to do that.
Right, so your experience is, as long as you don't really care what people think about it, you know, you just give it time and you follow your heart and your convictions.
Well, you also, in a way, I wish that I was more of a sociopath, because that way I wouldn't care. You know, like I would do something, people would criticize me for it, and I would just be untroubled by it. The problem I have is I'll do something, be criticized for it, but I'll keep doing, like, so the criticism hurts, but I have to keep doing the thing that I'm doing, you know? And like, so over time, you just sort of, you learn to put criticism in some sort of context.
Right.
You know, which I think is a skill a lot of people could learn now. Because in the olden days, very few people took themselves and their creative output and sort of presented them in a public forum. You know, the writers, musicians, politicians, whatever. It's a tiny percentage of people who are ever criticized. And now, everyone's criticized. You know, someone posts a picture of a cupcake and someone's going to criticize them for it. I almost feel like we have to like teach people how to not personalize criticism.
I think you have to turn it around. When we spoke to Elmer, he made a wonderful comment, and he said, especially when you're innovating, people won't get it at first, and they will be criticizing because that's sort of a reflex. But he said you have to understand that the answer is in the question of the others. You need to understand where their problems are, where they're coming from.
Yeah.
This then can help you to change things.
Yeah, and understand that person. You know, I think of veganism. I became a vegan in 1987, and everyone around me ridiculed me for it. Now, many of those same people are now vegan or partially vegan. You just have to, I don't know, there's a loneliness that comes with, I don't want to say being an innovator, but there's a loneliness that comes with maybe figuring things out a few minutes before other people figure them out.
Well, that's exactly what I was trying to get to, right? Because I see a lot of those brilliant, motivated young people, and then they get this reaction because they're just too early. So I quite often use you as an example when I work with them and say, look, yes, you can be early, but you know, you will be proven right at the end, and you know, your life doesn't have to be totally miserable in between. Just don't take all of the criticism too hard.
Yeah,
which is quite interesting, in particular in the music industry, because that has changed so radically. And you know, a good friend recently said he used to do tours so he could sell records. Now he's doing records so he can tour and sell T-shirts. But he's still doing some kind of the same music. But it's very difficult to find a place in there. Now you don't tour almost at all anymore. So obviously you found another recipe, or you've moved past that age. But for the young musicians out there trying to build a career in music, what would be your advice?
My advice is, first and foremost, and this might sound like a hippie cliche, but I think there's practical utility to this. First and foremost, love what you do. As we've seen, whether it's music, writing, tech, entrepreneurialism, politics, if you love what you're doing, you're going to be better at it, you're going to work through the hard times, and you increase the chances that you'll make something good that will succeed. You know, the love of making music is what sustained me when no one was interested in hearing my music. I just kept doing it. So that's first and foremost, is like, you have to be in love with what you're doing. Second is, as a musician, you have to learn how to do everything. You know, you have to be a songwriter, you have to be able to perform, DJ, write film scores, produce other people, do licensing. Like, to have an ongoing career as a musician, you have to be able to do all those things. The days of being a bass player and having a career, those days are gone. Well, for most people. And then, let me think. Oh, another piece of advice, and this might sound really odd. One of the things, like right now, I don't tour. When I play shows, I give the money to charity. I give most of the revenue I make from music to charity, because in the late 80s, early 90s, I started investing. And so now, I don't, because I've invested okay, like, I've invested in a way that enables me to not think about work. So the stuff that I work on is done for the love of it or the activist component of it. And so that would be my advice to young musicians is like, start investing.
Right. So if you're successful, make sure that you start to invest early on so you have the independence to do whatever you want afterwards.
And independence, as I'm sure you've experienced and lots of people will say, like, that independence, the ability to work for the love of work, or the ability to do things because you think you can create benefit for the world, where you're not focused on yourself. So I have my investment portfolio that I look after a little bit. It's very conservative, but it enables me to do everything else that I find meaningful. So and also it makes me honest. Like my restaurant, Little Pine, all the money that comes in goes to animal rights organizations. So when I ask people to eat at my restaurant, I can say, like, yeah, you should eat at my restaurant. The money goes to animal rights organizations, and it's not that creepy disingenuousness of someone saying, oh, you should give me money. It's really nice that I never have to ask anyone for money. Maybe that's a dangerous thing to say. Like, maybe tomorrow I'll find out that my business manager is living in Brazil with all of the money that I have. But for now, the freedom and the independence that comes from having a nest egg. So you can make music for the love of music, do philanthropy for the love of philanthropy, and never think about self-enrichment.
Right. Interesting you mentioned Little Pine. I've been following that, and I think it's a wonderful concept, and congratulations for that. I think, but again, maybe 15, 20 years ago, people would have gone like, it's kind of strange, or at least they wouldn't have want to be seen there because it would have been rather uncool. So again, I think you were a bit ahead of the curve. But again, what's driving it, I think it's partially this move towards the sharing economy. So we have a new generation come to the table, literally, in the context of a restaurant who don't just want to eat. It's also a statement, it's also a commitment, it's also a change of mindsets that is expressed in there. Do you feel that when you spend time there, when you talk to the people, when you see them at the restaurant?
Yeah, well, the ethos of the restaurant, I used to run a restaurant in New York. Yes. Restaurants, it's the worst business in the world. It's so much work for tiny margins. And you can be criticized for everything. For the temperature, for the music, for the decor, for the food. So you have to be legal and perfect in everything that you do. My main interest in owning and running a restaurant is advancing the cause of veganism and animal rights. Like, I wanted to represent veganism in a really attractive way. Because there are vegan books, there are vegan movies, vegan TED Talks, but something about a bricks and mortar space is really like a proof of concept that proves things to people in such a physical way. And so that's the main goal with Little Pine. It's like, the way I've structured it, I can never make money from it. The money goes to animal rights groups, and on a day in, day out basis, we sell food to represent veganism to our community.
That's wonderful. Keep it up and bring it to Switzerland. You should.
Well, the idea of opening another restaurant, I would never, ever, ever in a million years do that. Like, it's so hard. But I do like the idea of trying to turn Little Pine into my version of Paul Newman's Own, where, like, develop the brand, again, to support the organizations that I work with.
And again, that could be a wonderful example which might be taken, hopefully, up by others.
Yeah.
I think there's also a change now in society. I realized that again through my son, who was not born vegan but vegetarian, which is kind of strange because neither my wife nor I were. But already as a little baby, he started to spit the stuff out, right? So, and you see that happening sort of all around us. And I don't know, maybe there's something changing in the conscious fabric, or I don't know. At least maybe it's just some hope I have.
You know, it's funny. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's like, she has crystals and she's a yoga teacher and they're like Southern California, a wonderful cliche. And we were talking and she said, and this, I wanted to not believe this. She said, "Oh, you're a crystal child." And I was like, what sort of hippie nonsense is this? No, I'm an indigo child. And that your children are crystal children. So the indigo children, and I don't know if this is true because it does sound like hippie nonsense, indigo children are obsessed with righteousness and justice. And they're not very happy. But their goal is they want to go out and make the world a better place. The crystal children are the next generation who tend to have an innate, inherent sense of decency and ethics and tend to be a lot more relaxed. Like maybe your son, who was a vegetarian from day one. You know, so people like me who are like kind of angry, you know, you want to go out and fix the world, which is the height of presumptuousness, I know. Because I'm not omniscient, I don't know really what the world is supposed to be, but in my cluelessness, I can see the myriad ways in which the world is stupidly going wrong, you know, and you just almost want to correct that stupidity. So maybe it's indigo children and crystal children, like my hippie friend would say.
Well, let's hope that the right generation is coming to the table to fix it all, because they're not going to be left with the nicest of worlds. That's for sure.
And they're going to look at us, and it's funny, like the way we look at what people did 150 years ago, and we're horrified. We're like, they owned slaves. They made children work in factories. They put lead in the drinking water. They smoked cigarettes. They did all these terrible things. And we tend to think like, oh, we're so much better. Your children will look back at us and be like, they used petroleum? Like when in one day more energy hits the earth in the form of sunlight and wind than humans have ever used. And so your children will be like, so explain this to me. You dug like hundreds of miles underground to dredge up this toxic sludge, destroy the environment while ignoring endless supplies of free energy. Yes. Or the same way they'll be like, wait, you fed human food to animals, destroying the rainforest, destroying the oceans, destroying healthcare, destroying the animals, destroying human health, destroying all these things. They're like, why didn't you just eat the food that you were feeding to animals? You know, I'm hoping that slowly people will start to figure out just simply how to not be so stupid.
Right. Well, let's get the message out there.
Yeah.
Maybe sort of another question. We're all partly, at least, the result of our upbringing and our environment. Mm-hmm. And the same is true for products. They arise in the context which they are created against. But sometimes you can influence that by making conscious decisions of where you are and what you do. And again, in your book, you write about moving to New York, which I believe at that time was hugely important. Mm-hmm. And you wouldn't be who you are today, and the music you created wouldn't be the one it was and is without that context. But sometimes people don't like to leave their comfort zone. So again, I always try to tell people you gotta find the right setting if you want to move things. So maybe again you could share a little bit about your experience and then how that influenced this conscious decision to seek certain influence is for the success of what you're trying to do.
And I'm 53. I was having this conversation with a friend of mine, and we realized when I was 18 years old and I was broke, you know, I had no money, I just wanted to make music, and I looked at the world and I thought, wow, this is great. There are all these fascinating places I could move to that are all really inexpensive and are filled with artists. You know, this is, let's say, 1983, 1984. New York was cheap, San Francisco was cheap, London was cheap, Berlin was cheap, Los Angeles was cheap. All these like amazing cities that you could just move there with no money and start making music and be around artists. Now, where do you go? All these cities are now victims of their own success, and they went from being really inexpensive to being the most expensive places in the world. So I wonder, like that 20-year-old, when they look at the world and they're like, I want to live somewhere where I don't have to worry about rent and I can be surrounded by artists, where do they go? I don't know. Like, I don't know the answer to that question. Like, what's the inexpensive city filled with artists where new artists and musicians and tech people and whomever can go to have that period of relaxed creativity? You know, like when I was 20, I was like, oh, life is cheap, doesn't cost me much to be alive. I'm going to work on music. I lived in an abandoned factory. My friends were broke. Everyone was broke. We didn't have to worry about rent because rent barely existed. And now some kid moves to New York City and like if they don't make it in the first 2 weeks, they're homeless. And that pressure, I think it's forcing people are missing what we'll call like the gentle exploratory period. And everybody in history who's ever done anything really game-changing and interesting has had a gentle period of failure. You know, whether it's Bill Clinton to Steve Jobs to whomever, you know, like you have to have that period where you experiment and you make a lot of mistakes, but it doesn't matter because you're not worried about paying rent, etc. And I just don't know if that exists anymore, and that's worrisome.
Well, another argument is that in the old days you needed to have sort of a physical presence and be around people, around structures, in particular in the corporate context, because sort of that all started only with the Industrial Revolution, because before that we didn't even have a model to organize people. And even then the only two models we had were the Roman Catholic Church and the army, and we can debate whether that's a good model. But
I think I agree with what you're saying, although I would say that there's almost like a congenital predisposition towards gregarious structure. You know, even going back to like Sumatra, you know, like humans have always had, it's like that we're like magnets, you know, like we just want to be around other people.
No, I don't debate that. The question is just how you define that being together. And I think today we're so interconnected across the world. And again, as we are entering this age of liquid talent, as I like to call it, it's, you know, in the old days, people came together in a certain street, in a certain area, in a certain city, whereas today they can connect globally and they will form centers of gravity around a project, an idea. And that may be for a longer time, that may be just a short period, but it also helps to overcome what I like to call the illusion of satisfactory underperformance. Because in the old days, well, you basically had to work with who was around you, and if you got lucky, that was talent, whereas if not, well, you were doomed, right? And you only found out later once you ventured out beyond your realm. So there is that, but I'm with you. I think in particular when you want to do creative things, you need to bring different people together, and there is some element of physical closeness required.
And it seems like I mean, it's a description of what's actually going on now, is almost there's your home life, and then there's your work life, and geographically, to what extent do they need to overlap? Because what we've found, and I'm really stating the obvious, is people will give up all of their money to live among like-minded people. You know, like people will live in Brooklyn spending tons of money on rent rather than move 5 miles away to a different place, you know. And it doesn't even matter, like these neighborhoods, it's almost like the priority has become where people live in terms of quotidian quality of life. You know, where it used to have been like, oh, I want to move to that place because I can do my job better there. And you're right, now people work virtually all over the world, but they want to live in a place with like their friends, venues where they can see live music, their favorite restaurants, you know, like all the stuff that really informs their physical quality of life. Because what we found is when people rely too much on the virtual world for quality of life, they lose their minds. You know, like someone might be able to say like, oh, I don't need to live in that place. I can just have community online. 3 days later, that person's ready to blow their brains out. You know, like online is great, but it cannot at this point replace the physical world. Right. You know, 5 years from now, who knows? But yeah.
Yeah, I think you have to consciously sort of find where you want to be in virtual space or in the real world. I mean, but I think there's also phases you go through, like initially I was very much focused on the career. So when I wanted to do venture capital, obviously I had to go to those places where it happened rather than my beautiful rural setup, right, which was very healthy and wonderful. But then as you get older, obviously that changes. And I said, well, I've had my intellectual input to do what I do, but now I have kids and sort of I go back to the roots, if you like, more, I want to give my kids the experience I had. I think you also consciously moved away from New York to LA, which probably is reflective of sort of a similar development.
Oh yeah, and well, what's funny is I thought I was going to spend my entire life in New York. I still have an apartment in Brooklyn, but like I thought I'm a New Yorker, I was born here, I'm going to live here forever. And then I really started missing nature and trees, and I started thinking, where in the world, where can I be in a dynamic city that has lots of trees, that's warm in the winter, and is filled with creative people? And that's why I live in Los Angeles. Because it's almost like I have a country house, but I'm a few hundred meters away from the city.
Right.
So it is.
And you live in a forest.
Yeah, for all of the shortcomings in LA, to live in a place where I'm in a dynamic city, but I have a house surrounded by trees. Like my house in London would cost £70 million. Here, it's just a normal house.
Right. So you found the best of both worlds for yourself.
I hope so. I mean, no place is perfect.
Right.
But it's certainly...
For this phase of your life, it's perfect.
And also, I'm 53. When I was 23, I wanted to go out to bars and live venues every night and like be out there. And now I'm like, you know what? I'm pretty happy sitting home, reading a book, looking at trees.
Right. So maybe one last question. Another subject I'm very passionate about is blockchain technology. And then I believe that, like the internet, it's going to be a totally transformative technology. But like the internet, at some point we won't think about it too much. It will just become part of the fabric. But nevertheless, and then we touched upon that, it's going to have huge cultural impact. And then maybe two areas which people are debating. On the one hand, it may be something to fix the music industry and put the power back into the artist's hands and also for the fans, and to really unleash the long tail of music that is out there, which never sees the light of day these days in this corporate structure where 80% roughly of efforts go to accounting and legal rather than creating the actual product. And the other one is in the financial sphere, where people think that it may be the start of the third digital revolution and lead to the economic emancipation of the individual, taking out the intermediaries in between with their self-interest. What's your stance on this?
It's tricky because, and again, I'm very much stating the obvious, the blockchain has become, in the messiest, worst way, conflated with cryptocurrency.
I'm not talking about cryptocurrency as one of the applications. But
on
the blockchain, that's the hype. Let's just look at blockchain technology.
I went to an event, it was a dinner organized by a friend of mine about the blockchain. And I was like, great, we can talk about healthcare, we can talk about philanthropy, we can talk about art. Everyone there just wanted to talk about ICOs. And I was like, I don't care. Like, your ICOs are nonsense. Are you familiar with like the Dutch tulip bulb craze of the 15th or 14th century? Like, that's what you're talking about. Cryptocurrency is nonsense. It's original, what was his name? Yeah, so the original idea was wonderful, egalitarian. How it's become people trading Bitcoin and Ethereum to make billions of dollars, like that's not what it was supposed to be, And so I'm hoping that very soon the blockchain and the discussion around the blockchain can completely separate itself from crazy speculation around the cryptocurrencies. Because, it's funny, when I first heard about cryptocurrency, I was talking to a friend of mine, I was like, I don't know what it is. And he explained it to me, and I was like, I still don't get it. I was like, there's no value. Why is it so expensive? And he was like, that's it. There is nothing there. Bitcoin, it's nothing. It's just, it's tulips.
No, I agree.
My limited understanding of the blockchain, you're right, it has phenomenal, really egalitarian potential egalitarian consequences that can be really emancipatory.
Yes.
That's great. I just don't think anyone's talking, very few people are talking about that. They're all thinking, how can they make money off of Bitcoin and Ethereum?
Well, I think it's happening just last week, and I was very proud of this. I was invited to speak at the United Nations in Geneva, and it was about blockchain for sustainability.
Yeah.
Right, and I was also invited to speak with others at the European level, in the European Parliament. So people are moving towards that. I think there's those three levels. There's blockchain as the technology level. Mm-hmm. There's cryptocurrency as one application of the blockchain or on the blockchain with all the hype around it and whatever. But for the time being, it is a speculative investment asset class, if you like. And it's not even a currency because I can't go down to the shop and buy something with it for the time being. So we're not quite there yet. And then there is ICOs as a funding mechanism, and it's really just another way of raising venture capital for early stage ventures with all that goes with it. So I think we really have to move beyond that. But the potential is there. Just you mentioned charity, right? If you put it on the blockchain, you can really track where the money goes and take out the intermediary level. You can do the same in music. You know, if your song is played today in Chile, it's probably going to take 4 years until those 17 cents hit your bank account. Whereas if you link that to the blockchain, it could be there instantaneously. So there is this potential.
I mean, it's funny. So again, this event that I went to, which I thought was supposed to be at the blockchain, and I brought up, philanthropy. I brought up creativity. And the people there almost got mad at me because all they wanted to talk about were their ICOs.
Right.
And I was like, and I kind of wanted to say to them, I said, look, your ICOs, they're all going to fail. Because guess what? They all fail. At some point, hopefully, again, I don't really know what I'm talking about, but hopefully there will be a cryptocurrency that cannot be speculative, that actually just has a value so people are not like, oh, I need to buy this for my asset class. Just be like, no, it's a practical currency that enables people to do what cryptocurrencies were originally supposed to do. Right. So I don't know if that's possible.
I think we see a move towards stable coins, which are asset-backed and so forth. But it's quite interesting. The debate, in my perception, is quite different between Europe and the US. Mm-hmm. So the US reaction is indeed focusing on the cryptocurrencies, which is the speculative part, which is sort of the Wall Street influence, if you like. Trading and so forth is big in the US.
I would say it's more like, I think of it as being like Reno, Nevada.
Right.
Like the worst casino in the world. Like you can go in and like put all your money on number 26 and like you most likely will lose everything, but if you don't, you become a billionaire.
Well, it's a classical cycle, like .com, and it will go through the cycle, and there will be a boom and a bust, and there will be blood on the street, but eventually it will consolidate on sort of a stable level, and it will become what hopefully it will become. But the interesting part indeed is that the discussion is quite different. So also I was surprised because here in California I would have expected to be a greater focus on the technology as such, but it would appear, maybe I'm just wrong and it's my interpretation, that in particular the Silicon Valley, which would be sort of the natural hub for it, doesn't quite get it because the companies active there, maybe I'm wrong when I say I don't get it, but they come from a very centralistic point of view because all of those Silicon Valley giants, in their DNA, they have centralization. And obviously that's the totally different concept from decentralization, which runs through the blockchain. So maybe they're struggling a bit with it. And interestingly, I also see it a bit more in LA rather than in San Francisco and the Valley. So it's an interesting dynamic, but you right now see a lot of it happening in Europe and in places like Estonia and Switzerland, places that you wouldn't necessarily associate with technology, but that have a different cultural system. Take Switzerland, I mean, that has decentralization in its DNA and consensus with its strong direct democracy. So maybe there is a link. I don't know, I'm just guessing. I don't have the statistics to back it up.
Well, I hope that, because it, again, I'm stating the obvious, it does have the potential to really transform a lot of things, everything, potentially, everything involving data. Here's hoping that happens in like a healthy way that lives up to that potential, because I really don't need to have any more conversations with people about their ICOs or someone saying, oh, but 50 Cent made $100 million off of Bitcoin. I'm like, I don't care. No, he didn't. Like, that conversation really has nothing to do with the blockchain. Like, they could just as easily be talking about, investing in swampland in Florida or something. Right. Like, it's just that, and that, granted, the history of America is that, like the gold rush etc. People buying bridges that don't exist. So, I think it's part of human nature, but especially here in the United States, people like the idea of actions without specific consequences and without preparation.
Right.
Everyone thinks they can go off to become like the next Bitcoin billionaire, even if they dropped out of high school.
Right.
The idea that they can become the biggest rock star in the world, even though they don't know how to play an instrument or sing. The idea that they're going to be the biggest actor in the world, even though they've never acted. But the flip side of that, which is also horrifying, is people think they can smoke cigarettes and not get lung cancer. They think they can do crystal meth and crack and not die of overdoses. They think that, it's people really indulge in almost like pre-adolescent magical thinking, and it affects every aspect of their adult life. And hopefully at some point, as a country and as a species, we evolve past that.
Right. Well, with thought leaders like yourself, and
I don't know, but
well, no, truly. I mean, you've always been a huge inspiration to me, and I know to many others out there. May not always have been the easiest life you've chosen by doing so, but I think now there's a new generation coming to the table, which does appreciate that. And with the sharing economy, with new technological abilities, with transparency we're getting in the world, probably not so much with certain channels in the US, but globally speaking, I think there is this chance for a change, hopefully.
I think so. And yeah, it reminds me, it's actually some conversations that I've had with some friends of mine who are very, very successful, and they're giving up materialism or giving up unnecessary materialism. Like a friend of mine, I'm not going to name his name, who was a very successful actor in Hollywood. At one point, he had 4 private planes. Now he has no private planes. At one point, he had 6 houses. Now he has 1 house. At one point, he had a $300,000 car. Now he drives a Prius. Because he's like, it's that ability to step back and actually empirically assess the consequences on a personal level of the choices you make. Like so many people work under the assumption that when they have wealth and fame and all these things, that the quality of their life will improve. Except there's no evidence to support the fact that it ever does. In fact, if you really take a step back, more often than not, when people get beyond a sustenance level and they start having excessive wealth, the quality of their life starts going down.
Yes. The things you own start owning you, right?
Yeah, and then you start spending all your time worrying about, like, oh, I need to keep these planes going, I need to keep these houses going, I need to do all this stuff, as opposed to just sort of sitting back and like having a calm approach towards the things that are important and that give you meaning and that you value.
Right.
And
that's a process. It's called growing up, isn't it?
But I don't see too much evidence in our culture. I mean, look at our president. Our president is materialism gone wrong. Materialism that has metastasized, Like, we have a president whose only goal is self-promotion and seeing his name in gold. That's it. And hopefully people will look at that and be like, oh yeah, maybe materialism isn't all it is cracked up to be. Maybe having your name in 30-foot tall gold letters everywhere isn't necessarily a path to sustainable happiness.
Well, hopefully so. It reminds me a bit on Back to the Future Part 2.
Never saw it.
Yeah, you should, because there is like, I have a bit of a déjà vu when I look at it. Check it out and you will see what I mean.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, my pleasure.
That was wonderful. And all the best for your future, and we're looking forward to what comes next.
Well, there's another memoir next year.
Wonderful.
It's about, because this one ends with the release of Play.
Play.
The next one is both childhood and then the 10 years after the release of Play, and it's so dark.
Right.
It's so much so that my editor actually asked me, he said, are you sure you want to release this? Like, it's very dark,
Right. And again, I would assume then highlights what you've been saying, that since this book starts before your commercial success started, and this is then presumably talking about that phase where you were probably the most successful, that this didn't really make you happy, right?
That's the subtext. Hopefully that's the service aspect of the book, is putting it out there and saying to people like, look, fame and money, you might think they're going to fix things. They don't.
Right.
Look at John Lennon.
Right.
Look at Kurt Cobain. Look at like the number of people who really their fame and their wealth is what actually destroyed them.
Right.
You know.
Well, I can't wait for it, and thank you so much.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you.